Thanks, Angie, and thank all of you for coming out on a rainy night. You've made me feel incredibly welcome. I want to tell you there's one way we have something in common. You think of Kansas as completely flat. Well, KU is actually on a little mount. So as I said this morning, I feel like, in a way, I'm a Kansas hilltopper. There aren't many of those in Kansas. You've also made me feel very welcome. I'm famous for wearing red. I have like a million red ties, all bow ties, but I've never had a towel to go with it until tonight, and I appreciate that. The conventional wisdom about the 2008 election is that Barack Obama won it, but with the themes of hope and change. I want to remind you of one of the real high points of his campaign in 2008.
We've been asked to pause for a reality check. We've been warned against offering the people of this nation false hope. But in the unlikely story that is America, there has never been anything false about hope. For when we have faced down impossible odds, when we've been told we're not ready, or that we shouldn't try, or that we can't, generations of Americans have responded with a simple creed that sums up the spirit of the people. Yes, we can.
He went on with the Yes We Can theme for several minutes. I want to remind you a moment of the situation. He just lost the New Hampshire primary. He was expected to win the New Hampshire primary. He gives that conclusion to his speech, and the crowd there goes wild. The crowd also, apparently, that had been devastated, really unhappy in the Chicago headquarters for his campaign, sitting there like death and gloom, suddenly they're cheering. There are some reports that precisely the opposite happened in the Clinton headquarters, where they had been celebrating, and suddenly the celebration was gone because they saw what they were up against. A person who at the moment of defeat could give us the yes we can moment in America. And that was one of the main themes that carried him throughout the election. What happened to that man? A lot of people look at American politics, say, he's not here anymore. There's a kind of a consensus among many people that Obama has in some way failed us in the place we thought he was best, with his rhetoric. The man who inspired us has gotten lost. Now, there are three basic theories about this. Many conservatives say simply, well, it's become clear that he really is a socialist, proponent of big government, so on and so forth. And I'm not going to take that theory seriously, because I want to note to you that most of his policies, the big things he's for, have their intellectual roots on the right, not the left. The health care plan, the thing attacked most of all, was originally a proposal by a man named Stuart M. Butler of the Heritage Foundation. For those of you who follow foundations, you know that's one of the most conservative intellectual groups in the United States. Immigration reform used to be consensus, moderate policy. George W. Bush was for it. Ronald Reagan signed immigration reform. Cap and trade started out as a conservative idea on dealing with pollution. Obama is a liberal, a pragmatic liberal, but he is no socialist. The other two theories are a little different. Some people say that he's lost his capacity to inspire. Maureen Dowd is a proponent of this on the New York Times editorial page. She says he enacted a cool, aloof style, which reflected an inability to read America's panic. She actually had a column where she had a picture of Obama with Spock ears and said he needed to be less Spocky and more Rocky. In her theory, the man who could inspire us somehow is gone. On the opposite side of the New York Times editorial page, Tom Friedman and a number of other people say that Obama's failure is he's failed to give us a big set of ideas, a plan for how to make America better. He said that, I'm quoting Friedman, for failing to put a credible, specific economic plan on the table at the scale of our problem. I look at those three theories, and I've already told you I think the first theory is wrong. But I want to tell you I think the other two theories are wrong as well. And what I want to do is they'll tell you a story tonight with three plot lines. It's a story about the evolution of Obama's rhetoric from hope and change to facing a series of problems that he had to confront. That's one story. And finally, at the end, a shift to audacity, and then at the very end, back to hope. The second story is about constraints, about how governing is very different than running a campaign, and how he faced incredible constraints that forced him into these rhetorical choices. And the third story that I'll hit at the end is about basic failures in the American political system. A lot of the failures that Obama has had in persuading us tell us not just about him, they tell us about us. And some of the things they tell us about us and the political establishment is not very comforting. Now, I want to tell you about my two principles that govern my approach to rhetorical analysis. I want to use all the data there is, and I want to weave in audience data. If I can't explain real audiences, I don't think I'm doing much of a job. And my second principle, I believe in this old idea called objectivity. Maybe you'll just say I'm schizophrenic, but a lot of my research for the last 10 years has been focused on two figures: Barack Obama, Ronald Reagan. I was the main speaker on rhetoric at the Reagan Centennial at USC in the Reagan Library. It was for 90 minutes I actually had a VIP tag, only 90 minutes. But it was still nice. I got to see the back of Tom Brokaw's head. So I have views as a citizen, but I'm not going to tell you about those views because you don't care about that. I'm going to tell you about my views as a rhetorical critic who tries to make sense of what's going on and the interaction between what Obama says and the reaction it's produced from the audience. Now, I want to get rid of one thought. I talked a little bit at the beginning, and I said the consensus is that Obama won the election with hope and change, and he won the primaries with hope and change. But I think the theory that decided the election is quite wrong. In fact, after the Republican convention, after we had Palin mania, which definitely has faded now, there was a couple days where Obama was behind in the tracking polls beyond the margin of error, only a couple days. Obama solidified his support only after the financial crisis hit and the debates, where we saw someone who was cool, who was reasonable, who was able to explain his position, and I think charitably you can say of John McCain that he was not. Now I want to take you to the inauguration and the crisis that Obama faced. Obama knew going to the inauguration day you've got that dealing with technology is not my dead long suit. On Inauguration Day, we were losing hundreds of thousands of jobs every month. And Obama had seen the forecasts, and he knew it was going to get worse. Obama was heavily constrained. People expected him to give an inspiring speech. There were people who said he needed to be as good as Kennedy or Roosevelt or Lincoln. Pretty hard to do that. But he also knew that things were going to be bad. And so Obama knew it was not a time for inspiration. It was a time to motivate the Congress, and it was a time for perseverance. You often hear people say Obama had control of everything in 2009. It's not true. To pass anything in the Senate, you need 60 votes. There were 56 Democrats, 2 independents, that's 58. To pass anything, he needed at least 2 Republicans, and he needed to mollify the conservative Democrats. That meant that Obama had to do 2 things. He had to motivate the people in Congress, and he had to tell the people of the country that while things were bad, Things were going to get better. And that's what Obama decided to do. He began the speech by talking about how sometimes we have inaugurals at times of absolute crisis. He said every so often the oath is taken amidst gathering clouds and raging storms. And he added that we are in the midst of a crisis is now well known. He then told the audience in the 5th paragraph that the challenges we face are real. And then he said they will not be met easily or in the short span of time. They will be met. By the way, that echoes almost word for word things that Ronald Reagan said in 1981, almost word for word. He then went on to tell the American people why he believed the challenges could be met. He said that there were doubters. He said, but their memories are short, for they have forgotten what this country has already done, what free men and women can achieve when imagination is joined to common purpose and necessity to courage. He then said something that turned out to be quite wrong, as a matter of fact. What the cynics fail to understand is the ground has shifted beneath them, that the stale political arguments that have consumed us for so long no longer apply. He would discover that was wrong quite quickly. And then he turned in the conclusion to the idea that to persevere, we needed to remember that we had been through very hard times before. And we had gotten through them. And he reminded the audience of the hardest of hard times. The time after Valley Forge, before the American Republic is really established, and what had happened. And at that point, here is what the President said.
Our challenges may be new. The instruments with which we meet them may be new. But those values upon which our success depends, honesty and hard work, courage and fair play, tolerance and curiosity, loyalty and patriotism, these things are old. These things are true. They have been the quiet force of progress throughout our history. What is demanded then is a return to these truths. What is required of us now is a new era of responsibility, a recognition on the part of every American that we have duties to ourselves, our nation, and the world. Duties that we do not grudgingly accept, but rather seize gladly, firm in the knowledge that there is nothing so satisfying to the spirit, so defining of our character, and giving our all to a difficult task.
Not very inspiring, was it? That was about perseverance.
America, in the face of our common dangers, in this winter of our hardship, let us remember these timeless words. With hope and virtue, let us brave once more the icy currents and endure what storms may come. Let it be said by our children's children that when we were tested, we refused to let this journey end. That we did not turn back, nor did we falter. And with eyes fixed on the horizon and God's grace upon us, we carried forth that great gift of freedom and delivered it safely to future generations.
The consensus, it was a widely praised speech, but the consensus was it was dour, it was somber. A lot of people said he missed the mark because he should have inspired us. It was exactly right. He knew that we were going to face hard years. In fact, it was even more right than he knew at the time, because it turned out the economic forecasts he was receiving were not right. Things were much worse than the economists thought. And if you think about the last 4 years, you understand. We haven't had very many good months, have we? We've had a lot of bad months. This is where he started. What was that line he used? The winter of our hardship. How would you like to start a presidency in the winter of our hardship? In all of American history, only Lincoln and Franklin Roosevelt started in more difficult times. Only Lincoln and Franklin Roosevelt. At that point, Obama, now I want to turn slightly and talk about Tom Friedman's argument that he didn't lay out an agenda. I want to say that in one way Friedman is right. He didn't persuade the American people across the board to accept that agenda. And I'm going to talk about why that happened. But he definitely laid out the agenda. There are two goals of his agenda. The first was to confront the economic collapse. The second was to build what he would call a new foundation. To confront the economic collapse, he worked on the stimulus bill. People say he didn't get enough in the stimulus. In fact, his own economists told him they needed more stimulus. But remember, he needed 60 votes in the Senate. To get all 56 Democrats, both independents, and he ended up getting 3 Republicans, although one of those Republicans, Arlen Specter, decided he was actually a Democrat some months later. The only people in the Republican Party he was able to get are the only 2 moderates remaining in the Senate, the 2 women from Maine. He had to make substantial compromises and accept a stimulus bill that was not nearly as large as he knew was necessary. But it's all he could get. There are people who say he should have gone to the country and campaigned on this, but he worked as hard as he could to get those votes. So after the stimulus, knowing he'd gotten as much as he could to get the economy going, he turned to the new foundation. Now, according to Friedman, he doesn't lay out an agenda. But at Georgetown, in April of 2009, he talked about how we needed to lay a new foundation for growth and prosperity. He said that the new foundation was to be built on the pillars of regulation of Wall Street, investment in education, investment in renewable energy, health care reform, and a balanced approach to deficit reduction. And if you listen to that, you'll know he has made substantial progress on the first 4 of those foundations. I think we haven't made much progress on deficit reduction, although he tried to make a deal on that. So if he laid out his agenda, and if he succeeded in a lot of his agenda, why do we perceive him as such a failure? And we do perceive him as a failure. Well, I think the answer to that relates to the limits of rhetoric. Now, probably talking about the limits of rhetoric is the last thing you expect a rhetorician to do. I had this experience. Remember, I told you I spoke at the Reagan Centennial. I had the main rhetoric presentation. There's actually a link to it on our website at KU. It's not labeled very clearly, but there is a link there. And as part of that, I got to sit next to George Edwards at a dinner. And George and I had about a 30-minute back-and-forth argument. I like George because he's opinionated and he's shorter than I am. I like anyone shorter than I am who's male. Well, a lot of women, too. George says that rhetoric doesn't influence public opinion, that presidential rhetoric doesn't matter. I think that is obviously wrong in the campaign setting. I think that is obviously wrong about foreign policy rhetoric. I think that is obviously wrong about rhetoric and ceremonial occasions. How many hearts were stirred by what Obama said at Tucson, or by what Obama said on the night when he announced that Osama bin Laden had been killed. And I think it's obviously wrong in the long term about domestic policy rhetoric. There is a reason we talk about living in the age of Reagan, and although Reagan was a smart guy, it was his words that made it the age of Reagan. But it occurred to me that when you're talking about in the short term on domestic policy, I had what Al Gore would call an inconvenient truth. It occurred to me George Edwards was right. And I want to talk to you about why Obama has had such trouble selling his domestic policy agenda. And I want to spend a few minutes by talking first about systemic constraints and then about political constraints. The first of the systemic constraints is that domestic policy is inherently complicated. And I have to tell you, this is an unpleasant thing, but public knowledge on issues is incredibly low. For example, only 26% of the American people, according to the Pew Research Center, know it takes 60 votes to overcome a filibuster. Millions and millions of people blame Obama for something he could not possibly do because they don't understand their own system. My own sister, I had a friend who was a congressman, and she would say every 2 years, well, is he up for re-election? Well, yes, Karen, he is, and that's kind of been the way it works in the House of Representatives for over 200 years. And she's a lawyer. You know, if you look at knowledge of public policy, a huge percentage of the American people, Pew has done research on that as well. They say about 29% correctly say the federal government spends more on Medicare than on scientific research, education, or on interest on the national debt. That's a pretty basic knowledge. A month after the health care decision by the Supreme Court, only 55% of the American people knew that the Supreme Court had upheld the health care decision. And if you get into the details of public policy, no, people don't know very much. Now, people have lives. People have lives. You understand that. I don't dispute that. But it means that when you're arguing about domestic policy, Obama has to explain a lot of things. But if you explain a lot of things, people like Maureen Dowd say you're dull. That really is a box. If you explain things, you're dull. If you don't explain things, you can't change anybody's mind. It's a real box that people are in. And Paul Krugman said pretty simply about this, voters aren't policy wonks who pore over tax policy center analyses. Paul Krugman is understating how bad the situation is. To that I add that we have a media that likes to focus on the horse race and likes to always say there are two sides to everything. Global warming is a perfect example of that, where the estimates, about 98% of climatologists believe in global warming. But on the news, you'll see one person who says global warming is true, one person who says it's false. And that fundamentally misstates the expert consensus. But because of that, it's hard for ordinary people who have busy lives, homework, other things. They see on CBS News or CNN or God knows on Fox News, you know, where it's only people denying global warming. They see it's a split decision. But it isn't a split decision. So those are the first two constraints, are systemic constraints that exist. But there are also political constraints that Obama faced. You remember that first clip I showed you, the Yes We Can clip? You remember, some of you will remember the Will I Am video that I just showed it in my undergraduate class at KU. It had 25 million hits, that particular version of it. Obama was incredibly popular. And so many people have said, we expected him to come and change things immediately. The expectations were totally unrealistic. In addition to that, Obama was right on almost everything he said. But remember when I quoted him from the inaugural, it was also in the Yes We Can moment when he said our politics had changed. And that Yes We Can, he said, we are not as divided as our politics would indicate. That's word for word what he said. That was wrong. That was not wrong about all of us. That's not wrong about ordinary citizens. We could discuss these complicated issues and come to a rough consensus. There might only be 65-35, but we could get there. But you can't do that in Washington, where the political class is completely ideologically in conflict. But Obama had to make efforts to reach out to the other side, or he would be called a hypocrite. And he had to make those efforts, despite the fact, as I'll explain in a minute, it became clear very early that he was going to get no cooperation. Now, it's pretty bad so far, but the constraints that Obama faced are even worse than that. The third political constraint that he faced is it is much easier to demonize a policy than it is to explain it. There's a wonderful book by two men, Mann and Ornstein, one from the Liberal Brookings Institute, one from the Conservative American Enterprise Institute. And they conclude that it is an unfortunate truth that a vicious and unrelenting negative ad campaign can work, even if it isn't true. Think of how many people believed Sarah Palin's Facebook posting that the health care plan included death panels. Of course, it included no such thing. But millions and millions of people believed it because they'd seen it on the site where all truth is, Facebook. Let me tell you a fourth political constraint, another thing that is unfortunately true about us as citizens. Public opinion polling makes it quite clear we're not willing to accept much sacrifice if it hits us. Pew has done polling on reducing the deficit, and that 60% to 70% of the American people oppose raising a gas tax, cutting federal aid to education or transportation, taxing health insurance benefits, raising the retirement age, and so on and so forth. The only specific things, therefore, are freezing the salaries of federal workers and raising the Social Security contribution cap for high earners. And one suspects that high earners and federal workers don't feel that way. Don't you think? So the truth is, we want a government that will make things better, but won't ask us to pay anything for it. But unfortunately, there's this thing in life we've heard a lot about since Bill Clinton called mathematics that doesn't allow that to be true. So the public cannot will not accept sacrifice. Now I have to tell you, partisanship has been part of American life since the very beginning. When John Adams ran against Thomas Jefferson, some people said that Thomas Jefferson was inspired by the devil. So we've had it, and it's been worse at times. But the only time it's been worse is before the Civil War. And the rise in partisanship now is terrible. And Obama has faced that since the very beginning. There is a tradition in American politics that a new president gets a honeymoon period. And if you're a Democrat, you try to find common ground with a Republican. And if you're a Republican, you try to find common ground with a Democrat. That tradition is gone at this point. A major Republican opinion leader gave Obama until March of 2009, 6 weeks approximately, before Rush Limbaugh announced simply that he hoped he failed. One of your senators has famously said that his most important agenda is to make Obama a one-term president. His most important agenda is not to support the American people, not to revise the economy, but to make Obama a one-term president. And the point I'm making here is, you believe what you want. There are good arguments that Obama's policies are not a good idea. But I do want to make the point that many of the things Obama has for, Republicans used to be for. In 2000, George W. Bush was for cap and trade. As late as 2008, John McCain was for immigration reform. George Herbert Walker Bush supported something very close to the health care mandate. There's this governor of Massachusetts who supported something like that. You may have heard of him too. The point I'm making is that when Obama is labeled a Kenyan socialist terrorist, that's not remotely true. And that's because of the incredible rise in partisanship. Now, in the past, when presidents have faced let me give you one more example of partisanship. In the summer of 2011, the United States was about to default on the national debt. We'd never done that. The consensus of fiscal experts was if we did that, it would push the world back into depression. Because if you destabilize the American banks, we're still far and away the most important country in the world. Both political parties have politicized debt negotiations in the past. But Mann and Ornstein, the liberal and the conservative, have looked at this, and never before in the history of the Republic have people seriously threatened to default on the national debt. Obama knew that. Obama was in a box. Obama knew he had to appeal to enough real conservatives in the House who did not listen to experts from the Wall Street Journal, from big conservative organizations. That's how bad partisanship had become. That they were willing to default on the national debt. Boy, that was a real box that Obama was in. Now, historically, Presidents have confronted boxes like this by persuading the American people as a whole that something is a good idea. And that has put pressure on members of Congress. Most memorably, when Ronald Reagan faced a Congress in which far more in the House were Democrats, he reached out to a group called Reagan Democrats, persuaded the nation as a whole, and got his economic policies passed. So you say to me, if Obama really is a skillful rhetorician, why didn't he do that? The truth is he tried. And if you look at the public opinion polling, in the summer of 2011, he persuaded about 65% of the American people that we needed more revenue, and that meant the only people who has more revenue? Well, that would be the rich. And as it turns out, they have quite a lot more revenue. And at the same time, we needed to invest in infrastructure and give money to the states so we could actually have teachers in classrooms. Now, I'm boiling down the research, but I can give you the public opinion data on this.